So you see, the things that you have perceived as mountains in your life, they don't have to stay mountains. You could go higher. You could get God's perspective on what's taking place, and you could shrink the mountains down to molehills and go right over them. You're anointed to go over every single mountain in your life, not to get stuck behind them. But I want to encourage you today that when you are following God and following His call and plan for your life, you may come up against things that you feel are hindrances. You may feel like, God, what's happening? You can trust God. And this is how big God is. This is how big God is. Let's look back at Joseph. Even when the brothers sold him into slavery, in Psalm 105, it makes a statement about Joseph. It says, God sent a man who was sold as a slave. God sent a man who was sold as a slave. And when I read that in Psalm 105 about Joseph, I said, God, that is two very different statements. Being sold as a slave and betrayed is very different than being commissioned and sent by God. But what God showed me was that both statements are true, but they're different perspectives. One is a heavenly perspective, and one is an earthly perspective. The earthly perspective, Joseph was hindered. Joseph was sold. Joseph was betrayed. Joseph was thrown in the dungeon. Joseph, earthly perspective, was not going to fulfill his call. Divine perspective, Joseph was sent by God, commissioned by God. And here's the reality, guys. All things work together for your good. All things. Some of you are wondering, why am I even here at Bible school? All things work together for your good. God is doing something in your life that you can't have the full picture right now because you're in the middle of what God's doing. And sometimes when you're in the middle, you don't fully see the big picture of what God is doing in your life. Eventually, Joseph had a perspective change where he realized, no, I'm not sold as a slave. Although my brother sold me as a slave, I'm not a victim. And I'm not going to stay a victim of what's happened to me in my life. I'm sent by God. God is sending me. Here's the amazing thing. This is how big God is. This is how big He is. Some of you in your life, you're here at Bible school right now, but you've been through some hard things already. Some of you went through some stuff as a child. You went through things in your family. You went through things at school. You just went through stuff. Sometimes painful stuff. And the enemy would love to use that stuff to lock you down, to hinder you, to define who you are, to keep you from stepping out into the fullness of who God has created you to be. I know for me, when I was in Bible school preparing for full-time ministry, my biggest fear was public speaking. I used to cry in my dorm room, God, how are you going to use me? I can't talk in front of people. I was so afraid to talk in front of people. It was my biggest fear. And then I got elected class president. I don't know if you guys have student body here, but I got elected as the class president. And every single week I had to get up in front of the whole class and talk. And here I am, petrified of public speaking. And I felt so inadequate. I felt so unqualified. It was my biggest fear. Praise the Lord. Oh, if you have a fear of public speaking, get ready. God will probably put a microphone in your hand. And I remember at times just feeling like, God, my life just has so many walls around it. How am I going to overcome these walls? And here's the point. Everything that the enemy did to stop God's plan for Joseph, God used those very painful things to maneuver Joseph in the right place at the right time for the fulfillment of his destiny. Even the things that look like the enemy is doing to stop you, God is always steps ahead of what the enemy does. Always. And God doesn't send those things, but God will use them to put you here, to move you here, to put you in the right place at the right time, to then step into your call and purpose. Nothing can stop God's call for your life. Nothing. But I'm going to tell you the one thing that can. And I've seen it happen in pastors. I've seen it happen in ministry leaders. I've seen this happen in the ministry world, where people go through hard stuff. They get betrayed. They get hurt. They get wounded. And a root of bitterness comes into their heart. They get offended by people. Look, you're called to serve the church. And if you're going to serve the church effectively or serve the world effectively, you can't be offended by the people you're called to serve. Although temptation will come to you to become offended at people and to get bitter at people and to be hurt by people. Sometimes the very ones you pour your life out to. I've seen this happen. I travel every single week. I'm in a different church every week. And sometimes I meet pastors and they are so happy to be serving God. And sometimes I meet pastors and they can't wait to get out of the ministry. And they tell me all the horror stories of what they've been through. And some I've seen get such a root of bitterness on the inside of them. Look, the only thing that can hinder your life, it's not what happens to you. It's not the hard things you ever have to face or walk through. Those things can't stop you, because God's going to cause you to outgrow those things. The only thing that could stop you is if you get offended and get unforgiveness in your heart. That's the only thing that can disqualify you. And I say that for this reason, because Joseph, when God elevated him to a position of influence and power, remember this, God will never elevate you for your own sense of fulfillment, just so you feel good about yourself. He will elevate you for one purpose. That's so that your life can help other people. It's never for yourself. It's always to help others. Anything God trusts you with, any authority, any influence, it's not for you. It's for other people. Now, had Joseph had unforgiveness in his heart towards his brothers, when he got elevated into power, now you know this principle, right? Hurt people hurt other people. People that carry offense in their heart, it becomes a lens through which they see everything else in their life. And usually someone who's carrying around hurt ends up hurting someone else. Usually that's how the pattern repeats itself. Now, if Joseph had bitterness in his heart towards his brothers, when his brothers came to see him, because eventually they came to see him, because they needed help now. Now, this is part of the justice of God. The people that hurt you, God has a way of turning things around so that they need you. And God may just anoint you to help the very people you don't want to help. Joseph became anointed by God to help the ones who betrayed him. Sounds like someone else we know, called Jesus, who was anointed by God to help the very ones who crucified him. And God just may anoint you to help the very ones that bring pain into your life. And the brothers come to Joseph. And in the end of the story, Joseph has heard weeping and crying in Pharaoh's house. The whole house hears Joseph crying. But he's not crying out of self-pity, and he's not crying out of unhealed wounds. He is not crying out of bitterness or offense. He's crying out of love. Because somewhere in the process, he had a perspective change. And when you are following God, pursuing his call for your life, you will have to have a perspective change. The higher you go, the mountains that seem so impossible to get over, the higher you go, the lower the mountains become. The lower you go, the higher the mountains become. The more you get stuck in the limited earthly perspective, the higher the mountains look in front of you. The higher you go in God's heart and God's perspective, those mountains shrink down to molehills, which then become speed bumps. And speed bumps are not designed to stop you. They are there. You press pause very slightly, you slow down, and you keep on going. So you see, the things that you have perceived as mountains in your life, they don't have to stay mountains. You could go higher. You could get God's perspective on what's taking place, and you could shrink the mountains down to molehills and go right over them. You're anointed to go over every single mountain in your life, not to get stuck behind them. And Joseph didn't get stuck in bitterness. He didn't get stuck in offense. He did not get stuck in that junk. He forgave his brothers because he had God's perspective. And when his brothers showed up, he didn't say, oh, good, my brothers are here. I'm going to throw them in the same prison they threw me into, because now he had the power to do it. But rather than doing that, he said, come here. I'm Joseph, your brother, whom you sold as a slave. I'm Joseph, your brother. And he says this, don't worry. Don't be angry at yourself. Don't even be slightly troubled that you wrecked my whole life. Don't even worry about it. Don't even think twice about it. He says, because you sold me, but God sent me. You betrayed me, but God positioned me. You rejected me, but God embraced me and put me in the right place at the right time for His purpose to be fulfilled in my life. So while you were busy trying to destroy me, God was very active, making sure I would be put in the right place at the right time for His will to come to pass. And Joseph, from that dungeon, connected to Pharaoh and was elevated in a moment. But he had the perspective change. His mountains became molehills. He grew right over the walls that surrounded him from a perspective change. And because of that, he could forgive people around him. He could forgive his brothers. He could forgive his family. And because he could forgive his family, his heart was free to use his power to help people and not hurt people. And think about it. Why was that so important? I'm going to tell you why it's important. Because your life, and I said it yesterday, I have to say it again today. Your life doesn't just affect you, it affects everyone around you. Your obedience to God has a ripple effect that goes out. Not just affecting even this generation, but future generations to come. Because think about it. Because Joseph obeyed God and forgave, he could save a remnant in the earth from the famine that came over the whole land. Why was that so important? Because in the midst of famine, through Joseph, God preserved a remnant. He preserved Israel, through which the genealogy, the line of the Messiah was preserved so Jesus could eventually have a genealogy to be born through. Had the whole nation been wiped out by famine, the family line of the Messiah would have been stopped. So now, because of Joseph's obedience, we're here today worshiping Jesus. Because people were preserved in the earth, Israel was preserved so that Jesus could have a family line to be born through. We're here today because of Joseph's obedience. That's the power of one man's obedience. That's the power of one man choosing to forgive. Now put yourself in that position. No matter what people do to you, no matter what life brings you, no matter what you've walked through, never let offense or bitterness take root in your heart. Forgive, 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 forgive.